The objective for this video is to learn how to calculate the sample standard deviation. Here is a time series chart that shows the adjusted closing stock price for a company we will call Company A for a sample of 18 days. The sample mean closing price is $40.77. And here is a similar graph for another company that we will call Company B. The sample mean closing price for this stock over this period is $94.34. There are many factors to consider when choosing an appropriate stock for investment purposes. One of the measures that aids in this decision process is the standard deviation. Recall that the standard deviation is a measure of how spread out the data values are. Both of these stocks appear to have an upward trend in their stock price. But Company B appears to have more variation in its stock price. This variation can influence a decision with regard to risk. In many cases, an older investor would be less likely to be willing to incur high risk in an investment than a younger person. The formula for the sample variance is similar to the formula for the population variance, with the exception of the denominator. Note that the formula calls for us to subtract 1 from the sample size. This is done in order to overcome the tendency to underestimate the population variance when using a sample as a representative data set. Also note the use of the letter S as the symbol for the sample standard deviation. Here we have the sample data sets for the two companies. Let's begin with Company A. Note that the formula shows that we will need to subtract the sample mean from each data value. These are called the deviations from the mean. The mean for this data set is $40.77. Once we subtract the mean from each data value, we will then need to square, just as we did in the video for finding the population standard deviation. The difference here is that we are subtracting the sample mean rather than a population mean. The formula calls for us to find the sum of the squares of the deviations from the mean. That sum is 41.9192. Remember that the general rounding rule says that we should do no rounding until the final calculation has been made. So we will work with as many decimal places as is appropriate and convenient. Dividing this sum by 1 less than the sample size gives us the sample variance. The square root of the sample variance gives us the sample standard deviation of 1.570. The rounding rule for the standard deviation is to round to 1 more decimal place than occurs in the raw data. Now let's do the process again for Company B. The sample mean is 94.34. We subtract the mean from each data value and then find the squares of these deviations from the mean. We then find the sum of these squares and divide that sum by 1 less than the sample size in order to find the sample variance. The square root of the sample variance will give us the sample standard deviation of 14.314. Looking at the graphs, we see that the differences in the amount of variation within the data sets is reflected in the sample standard deviations. In this video, we learned how to calculate the sample standard deviation.